A quiet woman stood near the gilded ballroom doors, her presence as soft as the silk draperies that lined the walls. She wore a simple professional uniform, a small earpiece her only accessory. She was a translator, a ghost in the grand machine of a lavish wedding, there to bridge the gap between languages for the elderly guests. She moved with a quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible. Most people, if they noticed her at all, saw her as just another part of the hired help, a background character in someone else's fairy tale. But this woman was Danielle Carter, and her silence held more power than anyone in that glittering room could possibly imagine. The moment of cruelty arrived like a crack of thunder. The bride, Brittany Collins, a vision in white lace and simmering rage, stormed towards her. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Danielle, her voice sharp enough to cut through the clinking of champagne glasses. "You!" she shrieked. "You are uneducated. Why is someone like you even here?" She threatened to have Danielle thrown out, her words echoing in the sudden, shocked silence. What no one knew, what the sneering bride could never have guessed, was that the uneducated translator was the millionaire CEO who owned the very company that made this entire extravagant event possible. By the end of this night, jaws would hang open, the bride's face would turn ashen, and the entire room would learn a lesson about the true nature of power, a lesson delivered not with a shout, but with the calm, unwavering certainty of a woman who held all their futures in the palm of her hand. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. The wedding reception was a sea of glittering lights and whispered congratulations. Champagne flutes rose and fell in a symphony of celebration, their crystal rims catching the light from the massive chandeliers overhead. Laughter echoed off the marble floors as guests in expensive suits and elegant gowns mingled, their voices a low, happy hum. In the corner, near a table laden with gifts, Danielle Carter stood patiently. Her black uniform was plain but immaculate, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. Her job was simple: to help the groom's elderly grandmother from Spain communicate with the bride's family. She had just finished translating a sweet compliment from the grandmother about the bride's dress, a small moment of connection that made her smile. She enjoyed this work. It was grounding. It reminded her of what truly mattered: people understanding one another. Suddenly a storm broke through the calm. Brittany, the bride, her face a mask of fury, marched directly towards Danielle. Her pristine white dress rustled aggressively with each step. Her eyes, which had been sparkling with joy just moments before, were now narrowed into angry slits. She stopped inches from Danielle, her voice a sharp whip crack that silenced the nearby conversations. "What did you just tell her?" Brittany demanded, gesturing impatiently at the groom's grandmother, who looked on with a confused smile. Danielle remained calm. Her voice was even and low. "I told her you said thank you for her kind words about your gown." Brittany's lip curled in a sneer. "That's not what I said. I told you to tell her to move. She's in the way of the photographer." The accusation hung in the air, a blatant lie. Danielle knew exactly what the bride had muttered under her breath, a dismissive wave of her hand and a command to handle it. She had chosen a kinder interpretation, a small act of grace in a moment of stress. But Brittany wasn't interested in grace. She was interested in power. "I believe there may have been a miscommunication," Danielle said softly, refusing to be drawn into an argument. The bride's anger flared, white-hot and ugly. She looked Danielle up and down, a look of pure contempt on her face. "A miscommunication? Or are you just incompetent?" She turned to her nearby bridesmaids, her voice rising so that more guests could hear. "Honestly, why do we even have someone like you here? You probably didn't even finish high school." A wave of gasps rippled through the nearby clusters of guests. A few people exchanged shocked, uneasy glances. An elderly uncle lowered his champagne glass, his smile gone. The groom's grandmother, though she didn't understand the words, sensed the venom in the bride's tone. Her happy expression faltered, replaced by one of concern. Danielle felt the stares of dozens of people land on her. She felt the heat of their judgment, their pity, their morbid curiosity. Inside, a familiar old ache surfaced, the ghost of 1,000 similar moments from her past, moments of being underestimated, dismissed, and judged by the cover of her skin and the simplicity of her clothes. But on the outside, she was a statue of composure. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply held the bride's furious gaze, her silence a shield more powerful than any angry retort could ever be. Her stillness seemed to infuriate Brittany even more. It was as if she was expecting Danielle to crumble, to apologize, to beg. When she did none of those things, Brittany's cruelty escalated. "Look at her," the bride sneered, addressing the silent, watching crowd. "Just another piece of uneducated help who thinks she's important." She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a menacing whisper meant only for Danielle, though several people were close enough to hear. "I am the bride. This is my day, and I can have you thrown out of here so fast your head will spin. Do you understand me?" Across the room, polishing a set of glasses behind the bar, a young waiter named Luis Alvarez watched the entire scene unfold. His hands stilled. A feeling of deep injustice churned in his stomach. He saw the bride's sneer, the quiet dignity of the translator, and the uncomfortable shifting of the wealthy guests who did nothing. He saw a powerful person bullying someone she thought was powerless. The scene was ugly, and it was wrong. He felt a desperate urge to step in, to say something, but the fear of losing his job, a job he desperately needed, kept his feet rooted to the spot. The bride, satisfied that she had made her point, spun on her heel and stalked away, her white dress trailing behind her like a toxic cloud. The stage was set. The first shot had been fired, and in the quiet heart of Danielle Carter, a cold, clear decision began to form. The initial wave of shock among the guests quickly subsided, replaced by an awkward, shuffling silence. People turned back to their conversations, their laughter a little too loud, a little too forced, as if trying to erase the ugliness they had just witnessed. They were wealthy, powerful people, used to navigating social minefields, and the unspoken rule was clear. The bride is always right on her wedding day, no matter how wrong she may be. Brittany, feeling the eyes of the room on her, did not retreat into shame. Instead, she doubled down, basking in what she perceived as a victory. She felt a thrill of power, the rush of having asserted her dominance in front of her new, influential family and friends. She found her groom, Jonathan, near the wedding cake, where he was busy thanking a distant cousin for attending. Jonathan had only caught the tail end of the commotion. He had heard his bride's raised voice and seen the cluster of guests looking in her direction, but he had been too far away to understand the words. He saw the tense look on her face now and put a comforting arm around her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Brittany waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, nothing. Just some incompetent help. I had to put her in her place." She looked over her shoulder, shooting a venomous glare in Danielle's direction. People like that need to be reminded of where they stand. "They should just be grateful we give them scraps from our table." Jonathan frowned slightly. The word scraps sounded harsh, but he was swept up in the whirlwind of the day. The speeches were about to start. His best man was motioning for him, and the weight of 100 social obligations pressed down on him. He trusted Brittany. He loved her. He assumed she had simply been stressed, and he let the moment pass, a decision he would come to regret with every fiber of his being. Danielle remained at her post, her expression unreadable. Outwardly, she was the picture of professional calm, but inside her mind was a whirl of activity. She watched Brittany preen and accept apologies from guests for the unpleasantness. She saw the bride's arrogance swell with every passing moment. Brittany's cruelty was not just a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a core part of her character, a deep-seated ugliness that she wore as proudly as her diamond necklace. And Danielle knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this kind of behavior could not be allowed to stand. It was a poison, and it needed an antidote. Meanwhile, Luis the waiter could not shake the image from his mind. He moved through the crowd, refilling glasses and clearing plates, but his thoughts were on the quiet translator. He saw the way she stood tall, absorbing the humiliation without breaking. He felt a surge of admiration for her strength, and a corresponding surge of shame for his own inaction. He muttered to another server, a young woman named Maria, as they passed each other near the kitchen doors. "Did you see that? What the bride did to the translator?" he whispered, his voice tight with anger. Maria nodded, her eyes wide. "I heard it. It was horrible. But what can you do? She's the bride. We'll get fired if we say anything, but it's not right," Luis insisted. "She doesn't deserve this." "No one does. Someone should say something." Maria just shook her head and hurried away with a stack of dirty plates, her silence a clear warning. Luis was on his own. He felt a knot of conflict tighten in his gut. He was a good person. He had been raised to stand up for others, to speak out against injustice, but he also had rent to pay and a family to support. His job at this high-end venue was the best he'd ever had. Risking it felt like risking everything. Brittany, completely oblivious to the moral crisis she had caused in the staff and the quiet storm she had awakened in her target, was now the center of attention. She laughed loudly at a joke from her father-in-law, her hand possessively on Jonathan's arm. She felt invincible. She was beautiful, she was wealthy, and she had just proven that she was in charge. In her world, people were divided into two categories: those who had power and those who served them. She had just put the translator firmly in the second category. She believed she had won. But the real game hadn't even started yet. The injustice had been witnessed. The lines had been drawn, and the audience, both in the room and watching this story unfold, was now firmly on the side of the woman in the simple black uniform, waiting, hoping, for the moment when the tables would turn. Earlier that very morning, hours before the first guest had arrived, a different scene had played out in the venue's private parking garage. The woman, now known only as the translator, stepped out of a side entrance, the simple uniform already on. But the vehicle she approached was not a beat-up sedan or a city bus. It was a sleek black car, the kind that whispered of wealth and power, its windows tinted to a deep, impenetrable shade. The driver, a man in a sharp suit, immediately got out and opened the rear door for her, his posture one of deep respect. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice a low, professional murmur. "Good morning, Thomas," she replied, her tone warm but authoritative. She slid onto the plush leather seat, and the door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing her inside a world of quiet luxury. The opulent ballroom and the impending wedding felt a million miles away. She pulled out a state-of-the-art smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen. The phone rang, and she answered it on the first ring, her voice transforming. The soft, accommodating tone of the translator was gone, replaced by the crisp, decisive cadence of a CEO. "Yes, Mark," she said, looking out the window as the car pulled silently out of the garage. "How is the Frankfurt deal progressing?" She listened for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "No, we don't bend on the liability clause. It's non-negotiable. Make sure they understand that." She listened again, a small, confident smile touching her lips. "Excellent. Have the final contracts drawn up. I'll review them tonight. I'll join the quarterly board meeting via secure link right after this event is over." This was the real Danielle Carter. Not a translator, not a humble helper, but the founder and CEO of Carter Global Logistics, a sprawling international empire worth billions. Her company was a giant in the world of shipping, transport, and high-stakes corporate logistics. They managed everything from moving priceless art across continents to orchestrating the complex supply chains for multinational corporations. The company that owned and operated this very wedding venue, one of the most exclusive in the country, was a recent acquisition, a small jewel in her corporate crown. The role of the translator was a disguise, a deliberate choice. This was something Danielle did a few times a year. She would insert herself into the lower rungs of one of her many businesses, as a warehouse worker, a delivery driver, or in this case, a translator for a high-profile event. It was her way of getting an unvarnished look at her own operations. She wanted to see how her managers treated their employees. She wanted to know if the company culture of respect and dignity she preached in the boardroom was actually being practiced on the ground floor. She wanted to connect with the people whose hard work was the true engine of her success. Tonight's assignment was supposed to be a quiet observation. She was there to assess the event staff, to see how they handled the pressure of a high-end wedding, and to ensure her new acquisition was running smoothly. She had expected to see minor inefficiencies, perhaps a few stressed-out employees, the usual challenges of the hospitality industry. She had not expected to become the target of such raw public cruelty from a client. As the car moved through the city streets, Danielle ended her call with her COO. The fierce CEO persona softened slightly, and a thoughtful, more somber expression took its place. She replayed the bride's words in her mind. Uneducated. Grateful for scraps. The words themselves were just ugly noises, but the sentiment behind them, the casual dehumanization of someone perceived as being of a lower status, was a poison she had fought against her entire life. Now, she had found it festering in her own ballroom. The audience, now holding this incredible secret, became her silent partners. They knew who she was. They knew the power she held in reserve. And the scene with the arrogant bride was no longer just a moment of injustice. It was the trigger for a reckoning that was now, inevitably, on its way. Danielle Carter's journey to the top had not been a smooth one. It was a climb up a jagged mountain of low expectations and closed doors. She hadn't been born into wealth or privilege. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood where dreams were often tempered by the harsh realities of life. From a young age, she was brilliant with numbers and systems, seeing patterns and solutions where others saw only chaos. But time and time again, she found herself underestimated. In school, teachers would praise her male classmates for their leadership potential, while complimenting her on her neat handwriting. When she applied for scholarships, she was told she was a long shot. When she pitched her first business plan to investors, a group of old, wealthy men looked at her with polite disbelief, their eyes filled with a proprietary arrogance that made her skin crawl. They saw a young black woman and saw a risk, not an opportunity. She remembered one particularly painful moment sitting in a sterile bank office, a condescending loan officer patting her hand and telling her, "Maybe you should start with something smaller, dear. A little home business, perhaps." He couldn't see the global logistics empire she had mapped out in her mind. He couldn't see the fire and determination in her spirit. All he saw was what he expected to see. Danielle never got that loan. Instead, she took her meager savings, worked 3 jobs, and built her company from the ground up. One client, one contract, one grueling success at a time. She vowed that when she finally built her own world, it would be different. It would be a place where talent and hard work were the only currencies that mattered, not gender, not race, not background. She promised herself she would never forget what it felt like to be on the other side of the desk, to be the one who was ignored, dismissed, and made to feel small. That was why she conducted these undercover missions. They were her reality check. They kept her grounded and connected her to the beating heart of her organization. It was easy for a CEO, sealed away in a glass tower, to lose touch with the people who actually made the company run. It was easy to start believing your own press releases. Danielle refused to let that happen. She needed to see the truth for herself, unfiltered by layers of management. Most of the time, what she found made her proud. She saw employees helping each other, managers leading with compassion, and a culture of respect taking root. But tonight was different. Tonight, she hadn't just witnessed a flaw in her company's operations. She had witnessed a flaw in human character, a profound and ugly one. Brittany's cruelty wasn't just a bride having a bad day. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, The belief that your worth is determined by your wealth and status, and that you have the right to humiliate those you perceive as being beneath you. As Danielle stood silently in the ballroom, absorbing the bride's insults, it wasn't just the CEO in her that was offended. It was the young girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough. It was the young woman who had been told her dreams were too big. Every condescending remark, every dismissive glance she had ever endured, coalesced in that one moment. But now she was no longer powerless. The power was hers, absolute and overwhelming. She could have revealed herself right then and there, could have brought the entire wedding crashing down around Brittany's ears with a single sentence. But that wasn't her way. A public tantrum was Brittany's style, not hers. Danielle's power was in her patience, her strategy, her ability to see the whole chessboard. She didn't just want to punish Brittany. She wanted to expose her. She wanted the truth to be revealed in a way that no one could deny. Least of all the groom who stood by and did nothing. So she stayed in her disguise. She waited. She let Brittany think she had won. She was quietly preparing for the reckoning, not with anger, but with the cold, precise clarity of a surgeon about to remove a cancer. The bride had shown her true character, and now Danielle was going to show Brittany hers. Luis could not stop replaying the scene in his mind. The bride's sneering face, the translator's quiet dignity, the averted eyes of the guests. It looped over and over, a short, ugly film that made his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and shame. He went about his duties on autopilot, his hands clearing plates and refilling wine glasses, while his mind wrestled with a powerful dilemma. He knew what he had seen was wrong. Deeply wrong. But what could he do? He was a waiter. In the grand hierarchy of this event, he was even lower on the ladder than the translator. To speak up would be professional suicide. The event manager would fire him on the spot to appease the wealthy client, and he'd be blacklisted from every other high-end venue in the city. He thought of his mother, who relied on the money he sent home each month. He thought of his younger sister's college tuition, a bill he was helping to pay. He couldn't afford to be a hero. It was a luxury reserved for people who had a safety net. His was a tightrope, and the fall was a long way down. So he tried to push it down. He tried to forget it. He focused on stacking dishes, on avoiding the gaze of the head waiter, on smiling politely at the guests. But his conscience wouldn't let him rest. The silence felt like a betrayal, not just of the translator, but of his own values. He was clearing a table near a large potted fern when he saw Danielle again. She was standing alone for a moment, her back to the main crowd, taking a deep breath. She looked composed, but he could see a faint tightness around her eyes, the only sign of the strain she was under. In that moment, a new thought sparked in his mind. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing something small, something that might help. He didn't have to confront the bride. He didn't have to make a grand speech. But he could provide proof. His heart started to pound in his chest. His hands felt clammy. This was still a risk. If he was caught, he would be in serious trouble. But it felt different. It felt manageable. It felt right. Looking around to make sure no one was watching him, Luis slipped his phone out of his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he found the video function. He had started recording out of a strange gut instinct when Brittany first started shouting. He hadn't known why at the time, but now he did. He had captured the entire ugly exchange, the insults, the sneer, the threat. It was all there. He took a deep breath and walked purposefully towards Danielle. He approached her from the side, keeping his body between her and the rest of the room. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Danielle turned, her eyes questioning but not unkind. He didn't waste words. He held out his phone, the screen showing the video he had just taken. "I saw what she did to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It wasn't right. I recorded it. If you ever need proof, if you want to report her to my manager, I've got it. I'll back you up." He was offering her the only weapon he had, the truth. Danielle looked down at the phone, then back up at his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw his courage. She saw a young man willing to risk his livelihood to do the right thing for a complete stranger. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a warmth that seemed to chase away the chill of the earlier confrontation. She reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. She didn't take the phone. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes filled with a deep, sincere gratitude that went beyond simple thanks. "Thank you, Luis," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She had glanced at his name tag. Truth always reveals itself. "You are a good man." That was all she said. But for Luis, it was everything. He felt the knot of anxiety in his stomach loosen. He had done something. He had stood for something. He put his phone away, a sense of rightness settling over him. He had no idea of the true identity of the woman he had just helped, nor could he have imagined the profound impact his small act of courage would have. He had simply planted a seed of decency in a field of arrogance, and soon he would witness it bloom into a spectacular and just reward. Brittany, meanwhile, was holding court with her bridesmaids near the towering, multi-tiered wedding cake. She was giddy with triumph, the champagne and the adrenaline of her earlier confrontation making her feel bold and untouchable. She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, but loud enough for those around her to hear. "Did you see her face?" she said, a cruel laugh bubbling up from her throat. "The little translator?" She just froze. She didn't know what to hit her. One of her bridesmaids, a nervous young woman named Tiffany, giggled weakly. "You really told her, Britt." "Of course I did," Brittany said, fluffing the tulle of her dress. "You have to in this life. You let people like that walk all over you, and next thing you know, they think they're your equal. Honestly, people like that should stick to mopping floors or whatever it is they do. They don't belong in places like this." Her entourage of bridesmaids exchanged uneasy looks. They were laughing along, but their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. They were caught in Brittany's orbit, too intimidated by her forceful personality and her new wealthy status to voice any dissent. Brittany took a sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the room, a queen surveying her kingdom. "This is just the beginning," she announced, her voice filled with a smug certainty. "Once Jonathan and I are back from our honeymoon in Bali, I'm going to be the boss of this household. No more penny pinching." She was referring to Jonathan's relatively careful spending habits, a trait she found irritating. "And just wait until his grandfather passes," she continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Jonathan is the sole heir to the Miller fortune. We're talking about hundreds of millions. I'll finally be able to redecorate the entire estate. That drab old money aesthetic has to go." She spoke of the inheritance not as a future possibility, tinged with the sadness of loss, but as a prize she had already won, a treasure chest she was impatient to unlock. Her words revealed a deep-seated greed and a complete lack of empathy. To her, this marriage was not a partnership based on love. It was a strategic merger, a business transaction that would secure her a lifetime of luxury and status. Jonathan was not her partner. He was her ticket. She was completely blinded by her own arrogance. It never occurred to her that her actions had consequences. It never crossed her mind that the quiet translator she had humiliated could be anything other than what she appeared to be. In her worldview, the social order was fixed. There were the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak. She was one of the rich and powerful, and the translator was one of the weak. It was, to her, the natural order of things. She gestured towards the dance floor, where her new husband was awkwardly dancing with his grandmother. "Look at him," she sighed dramatically. "So sweet, but so clueless about how the world really works. It's a good thing he has me to guide him." Her bridesmaids nodded in obedient agreement. Brittany smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had a rich husband, a future of unimaginable wealth, and she had just successfully disciplined a disobedient member of the serving class. Her victory lap was complete. She was utterly and blissfully ignorant of the fact that, in a quiet corner of the very same room, The gears of her spectacular downfall were already being set in motion by the very woman she had dismissed as a nobody. The higher she climbed on her pedestal of arrogance, the more devastating her inevitable fall would be. While Brittany was basking in her imagined glory, Danielle had slipped away from the main ballroom. She found a quiet, empty corridor that led to the service elevators, the air still and cool, a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere of the reception. The distant thumping of the band's music was the only sound. She leaned against the cool marble wall for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a single centering breath. The anger she had so carefully suppressed was still there, a cold, hard knot in her chest. But it was not a wild, uncontrolled rage. It was a focused, purposeful energy. She took out her sleek, unassuming smartphone. With a few swift taps, she bypassed the public guest Wi-Fi and connected to a secure, encrypted network. Her screen lit up with the proprietary interface of Carter Global, a dashboard that gave her a real-time overview of her entire global operation. She ignored the blinking alerts from her shipping fleets in the Pacific and the urgent messages from her European headquarters. She had only one priority right now. Her thumb hovered over a contact in her encrypted directory. It was labeled simply Markham, legal. She pressed the call button. The phone didn't even ring once before it was answered. "Miss Carter," a man's voice said, crisp and ready. There were no pleasantries. He knew that a call from her, at this hour, on this line, meant one thing. Something important had happened. Danielle's voice was low and calm, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used when millions of dollars were on the line, the voice that her board of directors knew meant business. "Markham," she said, "I need you to convene an emergency board meeting." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Tonight, Miss Carter?" "Yes, tonight, at the Westgate Grand Venue, the main boardroom on the penthouse level. I want everyone there in 90 minutes. I'll make the calls immediately." "What is the agenda?" "The agenda," Danielle said, her voice dropping to an icy calm, "is a breach of the Carter Global Code of Conduct. A major one, and bring our head of security and all documentation related to the Miller-Collins wedding contracts. Every single one. Understood, Ms. Carter? We'll be there." The call ended. It had lasted less than a minute. In that short span of time, Danielle had set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of the evening, and several lives, forever. She put the phone back in her pocket, her expression unreadable. The music from the ballroom seemed to swell for a moment as a door opened and closed down the hall. Laughter and the clinking of glasses spilled out before being cut off again. The party continued, a vibrant, oblivious bubble of celebration. None of the guests, none of the staff, and certainly not the bride, had any idea that a corporate titan was standing in a service corridor, calmly and deliberately orchestrating a swift and total reckoning. The gears of destiny had shifted, not with a loud crash, but with the quiet, decisive tap of a finger on a screen. The storm was coming. An hour later, the party had reached its peak. The band was playing a loud, upbeat song, and the dance floor was packed. Jonathan, having finally extricated himself from his family obligations, found Brittany chatting with a group of friends. He looked happy, if a little tired, the perfect picture of a groom on his wedding night. He leaned in and spoke into her ear to be heard over the music. "Hey, honey. My father's financial advisor is here. He needs us to sign a few last-minute documents for the trust accounts. It's just a formality, but he says it's better to get it done tonight." Brittany sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. The idea of dealing with boring paperwork on her wedding night was deeply annoying. She was in party mode, not business mode. But then the words, "trust accounts," registered in her mind. This was it. This was the key to the kingdom. Her annoyance was instantly replaced by a smug sense of anticipation. This was the moment her new life officially began. "Ugh, fine," she said, trying to sound put upon. "But make it quick. I don't want to miss the cake cutting." She grabbed the arms of her two closest bridesmaids, Tiffany and Jessica. "You guys are coming with me." I need moral support for all this boring financial stuff. She wanted an audience for what she saw as another step in her ascension. Jonathan led the small procession out of the ballroom. They walked past smiling guests and busy waiters, completely unaware of the tense atmosphere that was waiting for them just a few floors above. They took a private elevator, the one reserved for VIPs, and rode it up to the penthouse level. Brittany chattered excitedly the whole way up, talking about the designer purse she was going to buy first thing in the morning. The elevator doors opened onto a silent, richly carpeted hallway. At the end of the hall were two large, imposing oak doors. Jonathan, looking slightly confused, said, "He said to meet in the main boardroom. I thought his office was downstairs." Shrugged, assuming it was just a matter of convenience. He pushed open one of the heavy doors and held it for Brittany. She swept into the room, a triumphant smile on her face, ready to sign some papers and claim her fortune. But the smile froze on her lips. The room was not empty, nor did it contain a single friendly financial advisor. The long, polished mahogany table was surrounded by people. At least a dozen men and women, all dressed in severe dark business suits, sat in stony silence. They were the entire executive board of Carter Global Logistics. Their faces were grim, their eyes cold and serious. They looked up as Brittany and her entourage entered, their collective gaze as heavy as a physical weight. The air in the room was thick with a tension so profound it was almost hard to breathe. The festive sounds of the party below were completely gone, replaced by an unnerving, absolute silence. In the corner of the room, standing nervously by the window, was Luis, the waiter. He was holding his phone in his hand, his knuckles white. He met Brittany's gaze for a fleeting second, his expression a mixture of fear and resolution. Brittany's heart gave a sudden hard thud against her ribs. Her bridesmaids, who had followed her in, giggling, fell silent, their smiles evaporating. This was not a financial signing. This was something else, something serious. A cold prickle of dread snaked its way up her spine. She looked at Jonathan, whose face was a mask of utter confusion. He had no idea what was going on either. The trap had been set, and they had just walked straight into it. The board members, as if on some unseen signal, rose to their feet in unison. The sound of their chairs scraping back slightly against the thick carpet was the only noise in the cavernous room. They didn't smile. They didn't offer a greeting. They just stood there, a silent, imposing jury, their eyes fixed on Brittany. The power and wealth in that room was immense, a palpable force that made the air crackle. These were people who moved markets and shaped industries with a single phone call. And right now, all of their formidable attention was focused on her. Brittany's confident swagger vanished, replaced by a fidgety discomfort. She tugged at the bodice of her wedding dress, which suddenly felt tight and constricting. Her smug smile had been wiped clean from her face, leaving behind a pale, uncertain expression. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "What is this? Who are these people?" Jonathan was just as bewildered. He looked from the stone-faced board members to his confused bride, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. I don't know," he stammered. "My father's advisor just said—" His voice trailed off as a side door near the head of the table opened. A figure stepped into the room and a collective gasp went through the small group by the door. Brittany's jaw literally dropped, the color drained from her face, leaving her looking ghostly white against her pristine dress. Her bridesmaids stared, their mouths agape. It was the translator. But it wasn't the same woman. The simple black uniform was gone. In its place, she wore a tailored power suit of the most elegant, understated design. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a simple bun, was now styled immaculately. She wore no jewelry except for a classic, expensive-looking watch. She moved with an aura of absolute command, an authority that seemed to radiate from her, filling every corner of the room. She walked to the head of the table, and the board members all inclined their heads slightly in a gesture of profound respect. One of the board members, A distinguished-looking man with silver hair stepped forward. His voice was deep and resonant, a voice used to commanding attention. He gestured towards Danielle. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone formal and cold. "Allow me to introduce you. This is Danielle Carter. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Global." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And she is the owner of this venue, and every company contracted for your wedding tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Brittany stared at Danielle, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The uneducated help, the incompetent translator, the woman she had threatened to have thrown out. That woman was a CEO, a billionaire. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The entire world as she knew it had just been turned upside down. The guests who had seen the earlier confrontation and, drawn by curiosity, had followed the bride upstairs, now crowded the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The power shift was no longer coming. It had arrived. Danielle stood at the head of the table, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable authority. She looked directly at Brittany, her eyes not angry, but filled with a clear, piercing disappointment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room, each word landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. "Good evening, Mrs. Collins," she began, her tone perfectly level. "We meet again. A little earlier tonight, downstairs, I was told I was uneducated. I was told that I should be grateful for scraps." She paused, letting Brittany's own ugly words hang in the air between them. The bride flinched as if she had been physically struck. "Let me be perfectly clear about a few things," Danielle continued, her gaze unwavering. "I did not finish high school in the traditional way. I was too busy working 3 jobs to support my family and putting myself through night school to learn computer coding. I used that knowledge to build a logistics software that is now the backbone of this multi-billion-dollar company." She gestured calmly with one hand to the stoic board members who stood like statues behind her. "I am the sole owner of Carter Global. Every vendor you hired for this wedding, from the caterer to the florist to the band, operates under a contract with one of my subsidiary companies. Every champagne flute, every linen napkin, every single light bulb in this building exists within a supply chain that I designed and control. Your entire fairytale wedding is taking place because I, the uneducated help, signed off on it." Brittany's face was now a mess of conflicting emotions: shock, disbelief, and a rising tide of pure, unadulterated panic. She started to stammer, her mind desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. I don't... It was a misunderstanding. I was stressed. It's my wedding day. I didn't mean any of it." Her voice was high-pitched and frantic. "A misunderstanding?" Danielle's voice was still quiet, but now it held a blade of steel. "You believe threatening someone's livelihood is a simple misunderstanding." She looked over to the corner of the room. "Luis, if you would." Luis, who had been standing rigidly, took a hesitant step forward. With trembling fingers, he tapped the screen of his phone. A sound filled the room. It was Brittany's voice, sharp, cruel, and amplified by the phone's speaker. "Someone like you here? You probably didn't even finish high school." The recording played on, capturing every venomous word. "Uneducated help who thinks she's important." And finally, the menacing whisper. "I can have you thrown out of here so fast, your head will spin." The sound of her own voice, dripping with contempt, echoed in the dead-silent boardroom. There was no denying it. There was no spinning it. It was the unvarnished truth of her character, laid bare for everyone to hear. Brittany's face crumpled. The frantic excuses died on her lips. There was nowhere left to hide. Danielle turned her gaze to Jonathan. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold resolve in her eyes. It was a hint of pity. Jonathan's face was a portrait of anguish. The color had drained from his cheeks, and his eyes were wide with a sickening realization. He was replaying the evening in his mind. Brittany's angry return from the crowd. Her dismissive words, incompetent help, put her in her place. He had heard the cruelty in her tone then, but he had chosen to ignore it, to dismiss it as wedding day stress. Now, hearing the raw evidence, he understood the true depth of his bride's malice and the magnitude of his own failure to see it, to stop it. He looked from Danielle's powerful, composed face to Brittany's panicked one, and in that moment the beautiful illusion of the woman he thought he loved shattered into a million pieces. The grand reveal was complete, the truth was out, and the consequences were about to begin. The recording ended, plunging the room back into a heavy, expectant silence. Brittany stood frozen, her own cruel words still ringing in her ears. She looked desperately at Jonathan, her eyes pleading for him to fix this, to say something, to make it all go away. But Jonathan couldn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his face a mask of shame and regret. Danielle Carter took a slow, deliberate breath. The time for revelations was over. The time for action had come. She turned to her head of legal, Markham, who was standing beside her. Her voice was crisp, clinical, and utterly final. "Markham," she said, "as of this moment, I am invoking the morality clause present in all Carter Global event contracts. The behavior of the client, Mrs. Collins, has been reprehensible and is in direct violation of our company's core values of respect and dignity." She then looked directly at Brittany, her eyes like chips of ice. "All contracts associated with the Miller-Collins wedding are hereby terminated, effective immediately. The catering service will stop, the band will cease playing, the bar will be closed. All pending payments from the Miller Family Trust to any Carter Global subsidiary are now frozen and will be subject to a full legal review for damages." A collective gasp swept through the onlookers crowded in the doorway. Brittany's head snapped up, her eyes wide with horror. This couldn't be happening. "No!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "You can't do that! This is my wedding! My perfect day!" Danielle's expression did not change. "Your perfect day was built on a foundation of disrespect, and that is a foundation my company will not build on." She then raised her voice slightly, addressing the head of security who had been standing silently by the main door. "Mr. Henderson, please escort Mrs. Collins from the premises." The large, imposing man in a dark suit stepped forward. Brittany's panic turned to pure, unhinged fury. "Don't you touch me!" she screamed, backing away. "Jonathan, do something!" "Tell them!" But Jonathan remained silent, his face ashen. He knew there was nothing he could do. The power in this room was absolute, and it did not belong to him or his family. It belonged to the woman his wife had tried to destroy. The security guard took another step forward, his movements calm and professional. Brittany's bridesmaids, Tiffany and Jessica, who had been watching in stunned silence, seemed to shrink back towards the wall, wanting nothing to do with the spectacular implosion of their friend's life. "You can't do this to me!" Brittany cried, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I am Mrs. Jonathan Miller." Danielle's voice cut through her tirade, cold and sharp. "You are a guest in my establishment, and your invitation has been revoked." Security Chief Henderson gently but firmly took Brittany by the arm. At his touch, she completely lost control, screaming and pleading, trying to pull away. It was an ugly, desperate scene. The elegant bride had been stripped away, revealing the terrified, spoiled child beneath. The crowd of guests in the doorway watched in morbid silence, their jaws hanging open. The power shift was not just absolute, it was brutal. Henderson, with practiced efficiency, guided the struggling and sobbing Brittany out of the boardroom and towards the service elevator. Her cries of, "This isn't fair," echoing down the hallway. until they were finally cut off by the soft chime of the closing doors. She was gone. The storm had passed, leaving a stunned and silent room in its wake. With Brittany gone, the suffocating tension in the boardroom seemed to ease, replaced by a stunned quiet. Everyone looked at Danielle Carter, the epicenter of the evening's earthquake. She took a moment, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the wedding guests in the doorway, and the confused expression on Jonathan Miller's face. Then her eyes softened as they came to rest on Luis, who was still standing nervously in the corner, clutching his phone as if it were a life raft. Danielle walked over to him, her powerful stride now calm and approachable. She stood before him, and the room held its breath, wondering what would happen next. Luis looked down at the floor, expecting perhaps a dismissal, or, at the very least, to be ignored now that he had served his purpose. Instead, Danielle smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Luis," she said, her voice clear and kind, "please look at me." He slowly raised his head, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Tonight, you had a choice," Danielle continued, her voice resonating with sincerity. "You could have stayed silent. You could have protected your job and looked the other way. It would have been the easiest thing to do. Many people in that ballroom, people with far more power and privilege than you, chose to do exactly that." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But you didn't. You chose to do the right thing even when it was risky. You stood up for a stranger. It takes a rare kind of courage to stand for truth when you think you are standing alone." She glanced at her chief operating officer, who nodded in understanding. Danielle turned back to Luis. "That kind of character, that integrity, is what I value above all else. It's what I built this company on." She then delivered the sentence that would change his life forever. "I would like to offer you a position at Carter Global. We have an opening for a hospitality manager in our corporate events division. The job comes with full benefits and a salary that is double what you are making now. We need more people like you in leadership roles." A wave of murmurs and gasps went through the guests. Jonathan looked up, his expression one of awe. Luis stared at Danielle, his mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. He was in total shock. He had expected to be fired, and instead he was being offered a career, a future, a life-changing opportunity, all because of one small act of decency. Tears welled up in his eyes, but these were not tears of fear or anger. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say, Ms. Carter," he finally managed to stammer. "Say you'll think about it," Danielle said with a gentle smile. "My office will call you on Monday to arrange the details." Luis nodded, unable to speak, a massive, disbelieving grin spreading across his face. The guests who had crowded the doorway began to applaud. It started with a few hesitant claps and then grew into a wave of thunderous applause. They were clapping for Luis, for his courage, but they were also clapping for the justice they had just witnessed. In a world that so often felt unfair, they had seen arrogance punished and humility rewarded in the most dramatic and satisfying way possible. The contrast was complete, a perfect, unforgettable lesson written in the ruins of what was supposed to be the society wedding of the year. The applause slowly faded, leaving a final, lingering quiet in the boardroom. The board members began to discreetly file out, their work for the evening done. The remaining guests, sensing the private nature of the moment that was to come, also began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves as they headed back towards the now silent ballroom. Soon, only 3 people were left in the vast, empty room: Danielle, Jonathan, and Luis, who was still standing in the corner, looking dazed and profoundly happy. Jonathan finally looked up, his face etched with a deep and painful embarrassment. He took a hesitant step towards Danielle. His voice was low and heavy with shame. "Miss Carter," he began. I... There are no words. I am so sorry for what she did and for what I didn't do. I heard her. I knew her tone was cruel, but I let it go. I made excuses. I failed. Not just you, but my own values. He looked genuinely broken. A man who had just been forced to see the truth about the person he had chosen to marry, and about himself. Danielle regarded him for a long moment. Her expression was no longer icy or severe. It was thoughtful, almost sad. She was not a vengeful person. Her goal had not been to destroy for the sake of destruction, but to reveal the truth and correct an injustice. Character, Mr. de Miller, she said, her voice soft but firm, is not about who you are when everyone is watching you at the altar. It's about who you are when you think no one of importance is watching. She gestured subtly towards Luis. It's how you treat the waiter, the janitor, the translator. Because the truth is, everyone is important. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the last hour. The naive, happy-go-lucky Groom was gone, replaced by someone who had been given a harsh but necessary lesson. "Thank you," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Thank you for showing me the truth, even though it hurts." He turned and walked slowly out of the room, not back to his party, but towards a future he now had to completely reevaluate. Danielle walked over to the large window, looking down at the sparkling city lights below. She had averted a potential disaster for her company's reputation by dealing with a toxic client. She had rewarded a brave employee and changed his life for the better. She had held a mirror up to cruelty and arrogance, and she had not flinched. Power, she knew, was not about wealth or titles. Real power was the ability to uphold your principles, to lift others up, and to ensure that dignity was a currency afforded to everyone, regardless of their station in life. Respect is the true currency of power. It is earned not through intimidation or displays of wealth, but through quiet acts of kindness and integrity. Those who mock the humble, who believe themselves to be superior, will one day inevitably find themselves kneeling before the very people they sought to diminish. As Danielle Carter turned from the window and walked out of the boardroom, she was not just a CEO walking away from a problem she had solved. She was the living embodiment of that principle, a figure of serene strength, leaving a powerful lesson in her wake, a story that would be whispered about in these circles for years to come. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.